Hey everybody, welcome back to Lightroom. I'm JT, and in this video, we are in Adobe Lightroom Classic, and we're gonna learn how to edit like Ansel Adams. I absolutely love his black and white style of film photography, and I love the depth, the foreground, the middle ground, the background, and the way his images just lead your eye through the scene. Typically, in my opinion, they start at the bottom of the scene and just slowly bring your eye up towards the top. They are just a masterful example of composition. So what we're going to do is take this photo I took, and I'll show you guys the before and the after. So this is the before image, a very green, lush waterfall. And I took this at f8, 24 millimeters, ISO 100, and it was a 5-second long exposure. The image is pretty sharp, but it's very green. The green is just kind of dull. It looks okay. It was a very rainy day, overcast. There was maybe a little bit of sun kind of peeking through over here, but it allowed me to get this nice long exposure of this waterfall. And as you can see, it's kind of similar to that Ansel Adams idea of having a lot of depth in your scene. There's a nice foreground here. Your eye is kind of led up to the middle ground, the front of this waterfall. And then there's some background here. You can kind of see back in the trees. And I think this image is a nice start, but it could be much better. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this image. We are going to turn it into this black and white image here. We're going to do some dodging and burning, some toning, play with our curves, and do some lens correction. So let's hop right into this Lightroom tutorial. So this is the beginning image that we're going to start with. Let's look at our basic toning tab here, and I can start off quickly by going to Adobe Monochrome or hitting V on the keyboard, and that's a pretty darn good start. But you can see there's a huge difference between the image that we're going to end up with and where we are now. So let's kind of start playing with this a little bit. Our initial image was a little bit warm, as you can see here, so I actually cooled the image down just a touch to bring out the cool tones in these leaves. And you can see that actually darkens our black and white image just a hint. So I'll leave our white balance around 5,000. That looks pretty good. I may bring down our exposure just a hint. That looks good. This is a pretty contrasty image already, so I'll leave our contrast alone and then start dragging our highlights down, and you can see we are slowly recovering some of the highlights in this waterfall. This is a great opportunity where I had quite a bit of latitude with the Nikon Z6, so I have a lot of room to really bring these highlights down. I don't want to completely crush those highlights and smush them into oblivion. We want some nice whites in there, but let's say around -70, -80, just to bring out this detail, because Ansel Adams images are very detailed. And we're going to do the same thing with our shadows. We want to bring out some of these details in the leaves underneath this waterfall here, but we don't want to push it too far. We don't want to be completely overwhelmed by detail by just turning this up to 100. So I'd say somewhere around 50-ish looks good to me. And then we'll do the same. We will turn up our whites just to get that hint of contrast. You can see in this waterfall here, as we start turning up our whites, we just get that little bit of highlight in the waterfall. I think that looks pretty good. And maybe we will, let's see, turn up the blacks just a tiny bit. We're getting a little more detail down here, and I think this is a good start. We're looking pretty good. Again, we can hit backslash on the keyboard, see the before, and see where we are now. Now there's a lot going on, and what we want to do is, this feels like a very detailed image, so maybe we want to kind of crush some of this detail a little bit. And this is one of the times I'll actually turn my texture slider down, and instead of cranking it up and really punching all this sharpness up here, what we're going to do is turn our texture down a little bit and even turn our clarity down a very tiny bit. We won't want to go too far with this. It'll make our image look like mush. We'll just turn it down, let's say maybe -15, turn our texture down to maybe -30. And what we're doing is just, we're getting a little bit of glow here and a little bit of glow in our highlights and our whites. And that's already looking better. We're not having our eyes attacked with a bunch of detail. We'll add a little more detail with sharpening later. Now I will take our dehaze slider. There was a little bit of fog and haze in the air, and I will bring that up to maybe 30. I think that feels good. And now what we're doing is we're starting to kind of make those blacks a little more punchy and make our shadows a little more contrasty. And I think that's looking pretty good so far. Here's the before, here's the after of our toning, and we've just recovered some highlights, recovered some of the shadows, and then added just a little bit of contrast in the lower end of the image. So that is everything for our basic tab. Let's go ahead and close this tab. Next, we're going to go to tone curves. So we will open up our tone curves tab here, and let's just play around with adding some points. I'll usually add one around the highlights, bring up those highlights just a touch. We'll add an anchor point here around the shadows, maybe bring down the shadows a tiny bit. I like the way that's looking. Now I'm going to do this lifted shadow technique where I kind of lift the blacks here, and I think that looks pretty good. It gives your photo kind of a matte look. We can turn that off and turn it on, and I like the way it looks. You can really emphasize that and give it kind of a film look. If you go ahead and crush the blacks and then lift them, but I'm going to leave my blacks alone here, kind of leave my shadows with this anchor point, and then that's a pretty pronounced effect. Let's bring that back just a touch, and I think that looks pretty good. Again, here's the before, here is the after. We're just making this image a little more punchy so that you can see these different aspects of the waterfall and you're not being attacked by detail and everything going on here at once, because this is a pretty busy image. So we're going to close our tone curve and then hit our black and white tab here. Now this is typically our hue, saturation, and luminance sliders, but when we have a black and white image, we don't have hue and saturation to work with, just our black and white mixers. So you can see this will be the luminance of the color selected in this color range. Now you can see that there's not much red happening in this image. There might be some orange. Yep, there's some orange here in this waterfall. There might be some, oh, there's a little bit of red down here. You can see that if we really turn that up, there's some red in the sand. There's a little bit of orange in the sand. I love bringing that out. That looks pretty good. And the same thing with the yellows. We don't want to do that too much. There's a lot of yellow in the leaves, but I do like bringing out this detail in our waterfall. It just kind of leads the eyes from the lower left up towards the center and kind of out to the right here. So that looks good. And let's see, our greens. What should we do with our greens? These are looking a little hot. I might actually bring down our greens a touch. So again, we are focusing the eye here, not out here, not over here, right in the center. Let's see, do we have any aquas? Not really. Nothing aqua, nothing really blue in this scene. So I think we are good with our black and white sliders. We'll turn that off, turn it back on again, and you can see we kind of focus our eye right here around the center. Let's keep working on that. Let's close this. And one thing I noticed, this image is just a touch crooked. So let's crop this image a hint. We'll rotate it a little bit, about right there. We'll push this waterfall towards the center. That's looking much better. We're kind of emphasizing the waterfall instead of the sides of the image. And what I always do, we'll quickly add a little bit of sharpening just to make our tiny little details pop. Sharpening, detail. I have some really in-depth videos on the detail tab, so be sure to look at those in my 30 days of Lightroom tutorials. And we'll just focus our sharpening with masking. And that's looking pretty darn good. We'll close the detail tab and let's go ahead to lens corrections. Now, what we're going to do is enable profile corrections. You can see this was taken with a 24-70. And if I turn that on and off, you can see there's quite a bit of correction. We've really flattened out this image from, had a little bit of distortion, and we've fixed that. So I think that looks pretty good. We'll close that. We'll go down to effects, and what I'm going to do next is add a vignette. A vignette will add some darker pixels around the edge of the frame and really bring our focus in towards the middle of the waterfall. Now that's a real exaggeration. So what we're going to do is just add a touch of vignetting there, move our midpoint towards the center, feather that out a bit, and then you can see the before and the after, and we really brought the eye towards the center of this image. So again, there's the before, feeling kind of flat, too much emphasis on the lower right and upper left. Throw that vignette on there, and that really kind of kills off the right here and kills off the left. Now, what I don't want to do is just completely crop that left and right out, because that's really a part of the scene, in my opinion. I think you lose a lot, and this image doesn't feel as expansive in that square or 4x5 format. I really like the 2x3 format. It gives your eyes room to breathe around the waterfall, and Ansel Adams images are just very expansive. So let's go ahead, let's close our effects tab, and we can see how far we've come so far if we hit the backslash key. There's the before, and here's where we are right now. That's looking pretty darn good so far. Let's do a little dodging and burning. So what we're going to do is we are going to make some masks. Let's select our mask tool over here, make a new mask. Let's do some linear gradients. And what I'm going to do is, once I've selected a linear gradient, I'm going to click and drag, and you can see the area that is red will be most affected by my mask. The redder the area is, the more effect the mask will have on it. You can see it kind of subtly fades out here. So I'm going to turn down my exposure a little bit. Again, we're bringing the focus towards the center of the image. I really want to feather this out. And when I'm done, I will hit Enter or Return on the keyboard. I'm going to make a new mask by hitting the plus, and then we're going to create another linear gradient. And again, I'll click up in this upper left-hand corner, click and drag. And again, we will just adjust our exposure, bring it down a little bit, maybe bring down our highlights a touch. That looks pretty good. We'll make some minor adjustments here. And then we can turn our masks on and off, see what our image looks like before and after. So here's the before. The edges are a little bit bright, too much focus on the edges. And then we'll just turn those edges down a touch. And I can always go in, make some minor adjustments, maybe crush those blacks a tiny bit, turn down the exposure, turn up or down the contrast, turn down those highlights. That looks pretty good. I'll do the same thing to this mask in the upper left. Kind of wiggle those sliders around, see what looks good. That looks good. I'll hit Return on the keyboard, and I want to make this waterfall pop out a little bit more. So I'm going to kind of do a bit of an inverted vignette, and we're going to dodge the center by doing a radial gradient over the center of this image. We'll make this waterfall really pop out here. That looks pretty good. And then let's take our exposure, turn it up a tiny bit, really make that waterfall pop out. Maybe play with our whites a tiny bit and balance out those highlights. And again, here's the before and the after. We really made this waterfall kind of come to life. And this is the same thing that Ansel Adams or his assistants would have been doing in the dark room with dodging and burning and using certain chemicals and certain techniques to adjust their exposure. Now here is a fun technique. Let's go ahead, hit that plus button again, and I'm going to hit the brush right here. And I think there are some areas in here that I want to emphasize. So what I'm going to do is I will hit Z on the keyboard to zoom in. I'm going to turn up my exposure, maybe a half a stop, and then I can paint in areas of the scene. Well, maybe half a stop is a little bit much. Let's try about a quarter of a stop there, and I can paint in these pixels that I want brightened up. So I will brighten up some of these leaves. We'll go ahead, we'll zoom out a little bit, and you can see what I'm doing to these leaves here. Let's brighten up these logs. Brighten up these bits of the waterfall over here. I like this log right here. Go ahead and we'll just paint in some of the areas we want to attract the eye and attract attention to. We'll paint those areas a little bit brighter, and we can always adjust the brightness, the shadows, etc. a little bit later. Because again, we have our master slider here where we can adjust how much we want these details to pop, and actually a third of a stop looks pretty good. Let's paint in some of these trees. Again, we're bringing our attention towards the waterfall. Paint some of these little dribbles of water and streaks going over here. That looks great, I think. Move our way around. Add a little detail over here. That log is bright enough, I think. Maybe we'll add a little brightness to this log, these little rapids going on over here. And we're really just bringing the eye towards the water. I like these little leaves here. Play with that brightness a touch. And I think that's pretty good. I also like this guy right here. Let's brighten him up a little bit. And again, we are just emphasizing parts of the image that we like and we want our viewer to see. So if you see that something in this image, maybe these logs back here interest you, add a little bit of brightness. There's some grass kind of coming in over here. I find this process pretty therapeutic and cathartic, just to kind of relax, throw on some good music, and just kind of paint your image the way you want it to look like. Just like Bob Ross says, there's really no mistakes in doing this. You can have some happy little accidents, and sometimes things just turn out the way you want them, or turn out the way that you wouldn't have imagined, and it ends up turning out pretty cool. So let's paint in some of this background here. Again, I feel like Bob Ross. We have some little happy trees going on up here. Let's zoom into the top here. Paint in some of these branches, some happy little leaves over here. And then, of course, there's always a happy little pathway. Let's have a little bit of a pathway back here. I don't want to emphasize the pathway to the right too much, but again, let's turn this off and turn that back on and look at the massive difference. Again, it's like looking at the blank canvas of a Bob Ross painting before he gets started, and then once he adds in all of his crazy colors, it just turns into a masterpiece. Now, I'm by no means comparing myself to Bob Ross, or am I saying that this is a masterpiece, but I really enjoy how far we've come in this image. We've learned how to do some masking and some dodging and burning with masks. We learned how to do some basic toning, some vignettes, but just know the power you have. And again, we can adjust all of this masking later on after we've painted it, or we can turn it off altogether. And we can have different brushes. We can invert the mask and make those areas darker. I really don't want to do that. I like them lighter. But here you can see we have our multiple areas where I painted here. We have our radial gradient where we brought out our waterfall. And then we have these two linear gradients on the upper left and lower right where we really kind of pushed back the upper left, lower right, and brought in the eye of the viewer towards the center. So I hope you guys enjoyed this image. I will hit return on the keyboard to save it. I think we're pretty much done. Let's go to settings, reset. Here's the original photo. And here is our Ansel Adams attempt in this waterfall image. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you learned something in this Lightroom tutorial, and be sure to subscribe, give this video a like if you found it helpful, and drop me a comment just to say hello if you want to in the comments section below. And until next time, get out and go shoot.